My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, I have no idea what's going on. It's Castle Amber.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Dungeon Module X2, Castle Amber, is an adventure for character levels 3 to 6 for the Dungeons & Dragons Expert set. It's by Tom Moldvay and was published by TSR in 1981. It's set in the province of Averoigne, which was originally detailed in 11 short stories by Clark Ashton Smith in the 1930s. To quote the cover text, "Trapped in the mysterious Castle Amber, you find yourselves cut off from the world you know. The castle is fraught with peril. Members of the strange Amber family, some insane, some merely deadly, lurk around every corner. Somewhere in the castle is the key to your escape, but can you survive long enough to find it?" So the contents. The module begins with an introduction where we get a basic overview of what will be taking place in the module, as well as some general advice for running it. We also get a high-level view of the Ambers, a family of squabbling, insane wizards. We learn about how their little province and castle disappeared from their world, and then there's a bit of box text that describes how the adventurers also managed to get transported to the dimensional pocket that the Ambers are trapped in. This section also contains a Wandering Monsters table.
The next section is the west wing of Castle Amber, featuring 12 keyed locations. Some highlights include a boxing match with a golem, a study filled with bored Rakastas, who are also trapped in this realm, a classic haunted mansion dinner party, the Hall of Mirrors, an encounter with a masquerading ogre, and ghostly hobgoblin servants. Next comes the indoor forest, which is 10 more keyed locations. Highlights: the Forest of Doom, a maiden and a unicorn. The maiden is actually a gold dragon. The Fountain of Death, King Midas's acorns, the Wild Hunt, a, quote, crock of crocs, the Flowers of Evil, and quite a lot more, actually, in this section. Next comes the chapel, where the module veers away from the somewhat gonzo, or let's face it, very gonzo, to the downright horrifying. This is 10 more keyed locations. Some highlights are a little drama involving a buried alive Amber, her brother Charles Amber, and the wicked and depraved Simon Amber. A collection of undead monks, a location called the Consultation Room, which is much scarier than the title would have you believe, and a bone golem. Next comes the East Wing, which is roughly 10 more keyed locations. The major highlights here are the Throne Room, where a pair of skeletal usurper Ambers are holding court, a ballroom where the misshapen court jester Little Ape can be found, and a tarot card reading. The last section of Castle Amber proper is the dungeon, which is 11 keyed locations. Some highlights here are the Demon of Death, the Gate of Silver Keys, which is also how you escape the castle, the entrance to the Land of Ghouls, and the lair of the Great Worm. The next section is the province of Averoigne, and here is where the module takes a big left turn. In order to escape this dimension, the adventurers have to go fetch 4 MacGuffins from around the province, each of which involves doing some small quests, such as destroying werewolves, hunting down the Beast of Averoigne, and protecting a town from a towering flesh golem. None of these missions are very fleshed out, and the module is very upfront about that fact. The DM has to be winging a lot of it, and the module says as much. So doing some prep work beforehand is really necessary to make this part of the module work.
Then the last section of keyed locations is the Tomb of Stephen Amber, which you gain access to once you have collected the MacGuffins from around Averoigne province. There are some guardians and traps the adventurers have to get past here before freeing Stephen Amber and being rather unceremoniously deposited back into their homeworld. The last section of the module is New Monsters, and it's also worth mentioning that tucked throughout the book are the various maps and handouts that you will need. So let's swiftly get to bona fides. I have only read this module. Jason, how have you used it?
We have just finished the 5th session of Castle Amber using Trophy Gold. It's probably going to take us 2 more sessions to finish. We're at the Tomb of Stephen Amber right now. But we've done more than enough of it for me to offer my thoughts as someone who has played it. So I feel confident in that. Things we liked about the module. Okay, look. This module is a hot-ass mess. But it's an extremely fun hot-ass mess. And I think that has to be said. It's just incredibly fun. There's so much to do and see here. So many fun characters and encounters. I would say it's impossible, like literally impossible to have a bad time with this. And I think the thing that makes it all hold together is the fact that the characters know they've been transported to a different dimension. They quickly learn there are other beings trapped in this dimension. And so they sort of just accept that none of it makes any sense. that the bonkersness of it is just sort of part of the reality of this place. And so I imagine when you read it, Tom, you can tell me if this is the case, but it's how I felt before I started playing it. When you read it, you're just like, what in the ever-living fuck is going on in this module? There's so much shit
yeah.
here. But in play, it has quite a different feel, and the players sort of settle into it in a way that you might find surprising. What was your thinking on that?
That was exactly my experience of reading it. Once I started out, I would say I was maybe up to page, I guess, 4 or 5, and still thinking, why is this popular? Like, this is just a whole load of nonsense thrown together in a TSR standard layout. But then as I got more into it, I started imagining what it's like to actually come upon these different scenes and so on. And it has this sense of, I don't really have a good word for it, sort of a sense of fun danger.
Yeah.
There are things that can / will kill the characters, wandering monsters.
Especially later on. Yeah.
But there's no menace to it. Like, it doesn't feel personal or that scary, right? What it reminded me of is, sometimes you go to Disneyland, there's the attractions that are quite high intensity, like Space Mountain or whatever.
Sure.
And then there's those really gentle ones that are for all the family.
The dark rides. Yeah.
Yeah, like Tarzan's abandoned treehouse or whatever. You're just poking around.
Right, yeah.
The rooms and the areas in Castle Amber are a bit like that. They're tableau to look at and maybe interact with. Like, you can interact with the Golem Boxer. That is, I think, pretty much the first thing in the mansion.
It's the very first thing you do, yeah.
Some stuff you can only really watch. Like, there's some ghostly hobgoblin cooks, and all you can do is kind of look at them, I think, and go, oh, that's nice. And then, and in some cases there are, like, pretty much empty rooms, or the ogre who's dressed up as the former lady of the house. So you can learn about the previous occupant, but the person who's actually there isn't relevant at all, I think, to what's going on. So, I don't know, it has that gentle fun, and then occasionally there's some fights, which seems like a pretty good time on the face of it.
Well, I agree with that, and I think that's probably the absolute right take for about 50% of the Castle Amber proper. Because one of the things that I found to be interesting about it, which is maybe more apparent in play than it is in a read, but I'm not totally convinced of that either, is that there's quite a lot of interesting tone shifting going on in Castle Amber.
Yeah.
As you've noted, it does start quite lighthearted and relatively safe. I mean, the Hall of Mirrors encounter can be quite dangerous depending on how your players handle it, and the ogre encounter can be dangerous, but they give the appearance of safety if they're not actually safe, right? They have a sort of almost a lighthearted quality to them. Then it sort of transitions to the interior forest, which mixes quite extreme danger with a whimsical, almost storybook approach to the encounters.
Literally in some cases, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll note here that section, the indoor forest section, ends with this blood arch, which is like, it's a big bloodstone arch thing that's dripping blood nonstop. And that moment is so jarring after the characters have been doing this like fairy tale forest thing. And it's very jarring and it's a pretty profound effect, actually. Like, when it happened in our game, everybody was like, oh, like, what is this all about? It was I don't know, it was interesting. The tone is shifting, right? So you have that sort of like the transition to the forest where it takes on this like fairy tale quality, but still very dangerous. Then you have the chapel and the east wing, which in my opinion are downright terrifying. We kind of move from the jaunty haunted house, dark ride type, encounters to more of a In the case of the chapel, more of like a grindhouse, neighborhood haunted house kind of feel, and then a sort of gothic horror mansion setting in the East Wing. And then you get to the dungeon later on, which is almost alien in nature.
Very Lovecraftian down there, isn't it?
Yeah, very Lovecraftian, very alien, just like weird puzzles and strange interdimensional prison cells and weird shit, right? Gates. The overall effect of Castle Amber is a dungeon that is both gonzo, but with a surprising amount of tension. I found it to be a very fascinating mix and not something I've played a lot of. It felt pretty unique to me in play, that mix, that gonzo-ness combined with what can be a very, very tense experience. Like the players in our sessions, especially when we were in Castle Amber proper, they were really enjoying it. They were having a good time. They wanted to know what was around the corner because it's that kind of dungeon. But they were also very, very worried about dying. Like, they felt the tension. Like, they knew it was extremely dangerous, the stuff they were doing, but they just wanted to know more. And I think that's kind of the effect. And I think that's why it's so popular.
Well, that's really good because, the East Wing, it kind of transitions into full Gothic Edgar Allan Poe. There's a lot of direct takes from Edgar Allan Poe.
Absolutely.
And reading that, I didn't think, incorrectly, I'm pleased to have you tell me, I didn't think it necessarily sold the real Grand Guignol horror of Poe. I was thinking is a bit more like, again, the slightly Disney version where it's you've got the items, but they're not that scary. But if it is tense, that's wonderful. I think what's good actually about some of that transition work as well is that, for example, the West Wing has that ogre who, by the way, reminds me of that goblin that's dressed up in the sorceress's dress in Warhammer modules.
Yes.
But the backstory there is there's a body in the chimney, I think, or bricked up in a wall.
The one bricked up in a wall is alive, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a different one. The dead woman is in the chimney one, which is spoilers for Murders in the Rue Morgue, but I just did it. So that's a kind of a hint. I mean, probably unless someone's been reading the collected Poe like that week, they wouldn't notice it. But that's a hint of stuff that's going to come later. And then you get to the East Wing and you've got your takeoffs of, well, not exactly of Mask of the Red Death, but it's kind of there. And then the definite takeoff from the Fall of the House of Usher. Among others, which is so interesting. And it's got all these intertextual callbacks, this kind of, what's the word, optional intertextuality, where if you know what the story is, it adds something. It's got Billy Goat's gruff at one point, which is kind of...
It does, yes.
And then, so that again, that's sort of silly, but it's also telling you, you're going to see more things from stories you may recognize. I think that's what it's doing. Who knows?
Yeah, it's interesting because what I thought was so fascinating about running this module and watching how the players were reacting to things is every player seemed to bring their own interpretation and their own way of receiving the module. Like, one of the players, Jim, really picked up on this idea of the whole thing being like a soap opera drama between the Ambers, but it's not really written that way. The Ambers, they're almost like cabined off from each other. I mean, in a haunted house style, they sort of just exist in their own little place, and they don't make too many references to one another. But for whatever reason, Jim really just loved the idea of this and added that to his own experience.
Yeah,
it became like this Amber drama, right?
Like a head canon soap opera,
yeah. And all the players were doing stuff like that. Like some of the players picked up on the literary references. One of the players is very into Clark Ashton Smith, and even though Castle Amber proper is not part of the Clark Ashton Smith stories, I think he was really picking up on some of the texture, at least. It's a fascinating module in that way. At the end of the day, it's just this big invitation to have fun, and it does that really, really well. It's a little bit like if you were a second grader just thinking of all the cool shit you love and trying to put it all in one place, but instead of a second grader, you were like a college literature major or something, right? And you did that, right? Like, it's like that spirit of like, I'm gonna just take all the stuff I love and put it all in one thing. We had a good time with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's not just, we've talked about the kind of walking in on these things, and you're right, it's sort of like those animatronic figures going, I say, have you been talking to my brother? No, this is, and then like little kind of set spiels for you to do. But there are some very, well, I was going to say OSR-y, it's from 1981, it's just old, some bits to actually play with, like toys. So there is the Hall of Mirrors, and what's struck me is a lot of these encounter areas are like one paragraph long, but I could see a group spending half a session on it. There's that puzzle where you're looking for silver keys later, and you walk in, there's a room, it's got a vat of acid in it, like anybody has lying around in their castle. But floating on the vat of acid is a glass sphere, which will break if you handle it roughly. Inside the sphere is the key you need. If it falls in the acid, it'll melt. What do you do? And like,
Right, yeah.
it's like a game in the Crystal Maze. And it's just, it's simple, but it's difficult, I think, probably. Unless someone rummages in their spellbook and happens to have exactly the thing. But that's fun in itself. You know, you often get these modules where they'll spend ages like trying to, mind reading magic doesn't work here because blah, blah, blah. Or your superheroes can't break through this wall because they knew you were coming. But actually, it's fun if like you have something that would completely stymie a normal person and you know a spell, right?
Yeah.
That is the point of it. And it also has what, if you are a listener to Monster Man, the podcast by James Holloway, he often talks about monsters that are environmental monsters. So something that's like a killer mushroom that can't really move and chase after you. And if you see it, you just avoid it. But once you've seen it, then later in the adventure, maybe you're having to run away and it becomes difficult to avoid it, or you would lead someone into it on purpose. Mm-hmm. And there's one that struck me in at Castle Amber is the Hall of Mirrors, which I think is great. Basically, it extinguishes all your lights.
Right. Yeah.
Then there's a huge flash of too bright light that blinds you for, I think, 3d6 minutes or something, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Whatever. The point is, it gives you this brilliant, it's a great visual for a start, this suddenly flaring into light, sort of Versailles-style mirrors room, or whatever it is.
Right,
I think it's more mosaic-y, but you get the idea. And it gives you this situation of, what do we do? What do we do? We can't see. And it tells you to make sure they know they're going to get their sight back. They only have to last a short amount of time without being able to see. It's refreshingly upfront about what the point of the scene is, like directly addressing the GM. It does that in a few places. It gives an opportunity for people to play their characters. Mm-hmm. They're all going to react differently to how they are suddenly blinded. And it gives an environment that later on the PCs could use against a wandering monster if they think ahead. They'd be like, we can't fight this thing, let's run through the Hall of Mirrors, but cover our eyes.
Right, yeah.
You know? So like a really nice, simple, but I would say this one's not really difficult because you can't avoid it, it just happens to you. But it's something that is very interactive. You could think of lots of things to do with it once it started happening to you.
That's one of the things I really loved about Castle Amber, in addition to just like the sort of weird tone shifting and stuff and just the packed fun nature of it. The module is extremely easy to run with the rules light systems I prefer, because while there is a lot of stuff in this module and it is packed to the gills, none of it is presented in great detail. You get just kind of the basics of what you need to run it. And then from there, it's just about the player characters interacting with the stuff that's in there. And when you have a system that's like a little more collaborative, kind of like Trophy Gold, that works really, really well. You want things to be a little sketchier so that you have space to fill in things, like based off how your die rolls go. And so I really love that part of it. And I think that you kind of touched on that a little bit when you were saying that it's truly like just a set piece that you arrive at and you interact with and see how it goes. And that's just great fun. I mean, that's just, we're going to talk about that more in the expert delve, but it's a big connected set of set pieces and it's really enjoyable. And there is an interactivity there, right? Like, yes, it's all a little stagey because that's sort of the nature of the dungeon. But once you're in the set dressing, once you're in that stagey bit, there's a lot to do. And you can kind of interact with it at any level you want. And different play groups will sort of grab onto different things. My group was really interested in the Haunted Feast. They were just really into that. They wanted to have that scene where they go and sit down at the long table and the ghosts are all there and food is being served by the hobgoblins. As written, you just sort of eat the magical food and something happens or doesn't happen. But my players were really into it. They wanted to like talk to the ghosts. They wanted to learn more about what was going on. They gravitated toward that. They enjoyed the lounging about Rakastas that are trapped in Castle Amber like them. That whole scene in the module is just what it sounds like. It's just a bunch of Rakastas laying around on pillows or whatever. And there's really not much to do there, except it sort of foreshadows something that happens later in the indoor forest. But the players were very into it and they wanted to know more. And so they leaned into that. They were less interested in what was going on with the ogre. They didn't actually see the ogre when they played through. They heard what was going on, but they didn't actually go any further with it. I think that's a fun aspect of it. Like the play group gets to sort of like decide what they want to pick up and turn around in their hand.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel, but I can't prove, that the core of this module is that slightly kind of rules minimalist, faffing around talking to cat people adventure. And then I think the TSR editorial guys went, no, come on, you got to put some combat stats on this. What are you doing?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Like, for example, there's an absolute disconnect between the scene of Madeline Amber having clawed her way out of the grave, returning, and then there's this hugely combat-focused follow-up paragraph after this gothic horror scene, and it really smacks of one adventure being written and then someone going, Tom, nobody's going to stand for this. You're going to have to armor class this up.
Well, it's definitely one of those historical artifacts, right?
Yeah.
We talk about that a lot when we talk about these older modules, like where the module kind of fits in historically. And I think you're right. There is a tension there between the authors just wanting to like kind of have cool set piece scenes, and then TSR requiring some combats and stuff, I think it's a really interesting module from a historical standpoint in this way, which is, as I was reading it, and indeed as we played it, I had this thought even more. I have to imagine Castle Amber is very, very influential on things that would come later.
Yep.
You can see great big parts of Ravenloft, for example, in Castle Amber. In fact, when we did the Ravenloft episode, I thought that Ravenloft had to have been influential on the designers of video games like Dark Souls, because so much of Ravenloft felt like Dark Souls. But honestly, lots of parts of Castle Amber feel like Dark Souls, and I wonder if that was the true inspiration. The chapel sequence, for example, everything that's going on in the chapel feels so much like modern-day prestige horror action video game. Some of the Averoigne province encounters have that feel too, the bigness of them, the scale of them. So I think it's interesting from that standpoint, because it is such a popular module. I get the impression that it was a big influence on many things that would come after. I mean, sometimes in just little ways.
For sure. I mean, I think probably Ravenloft is going to have been the conduit for a lot of influence anyway, because it's even bigger than Castle Amber, right? But
Sure.
I think there's a lot of the kind of 80s British RPG writing that must have been influenced by this, or that kind of latter-day TSR UK crew.
Yeah.
Because I was reading this, I recognise what I think is a segment of Castle Drachenfels, the ridiculously overpowered latter-day Warhammer module, like the colour-coded rooms with guardians, the weird hunched dwarf who's stolen from Edgar Allan Poe, and so on. Yeah, this atmosphere, I think this is definitely that kind of Warhammer-y fighting fantasy. The weird disconnect between, especially grotesque servant classes who are put upon by their masters, and then the mind-bogglingly eccentric interdimensional wizards. That's a real fighting fantasy setting thing, I would say, and kind of a thread that you see in the 80s and 90s British game writing as well.
This will come up in the Expert Delve too, but I actually got some Warlock on Firetop Mountain vibes in some ways, especially like in presentation and structure. Let's just kind of wrap up with things we like. I've got a couple more things I want to say here.
Sure.
The Averoigne section, which we haven't really talked about much yet, that's that really sketchy bit where you have to go chase after
well, I have a question about this. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. It's quite enjoyable. In play, it feels like a reward for surviving the castle. And I think that's important, because the module could have just ended at walking out of the Silver Gate in the castle and you're back home, right? Could have totally ended there and it would have been fine. But then you have this extra bit. And that extra bit, it's fun in a different way. It feels like a reward. It was almost like they could breathe again, because I mentioned that it's actually quite tense in the castle. But once they got to the province section, it feels a little safer, but there's still some fun stuff for us to do. We get to chase some MacGuffins. It just had this almost like an exhale quality to it, which I think is great. And I think we're going to go back to the sort of inhale quality when we get to the Tomb of Stephen Amber, which we have not done yet, because the Tomb of Stephen Amber is kind of right back into that tense, horror-y sort of thing. That should be a lot of fun. So I really enjoyed that. Also very easy to do in Trophy Gold, because the sketchiness serves Trophy Gold really well. So I was very happy with that. And the last thing I want to say is just some presentation stuff. The cover art is not great, in my opinion. I think it's kind of goofy looking. But the interiors are lovely, and they are of a kind that you would expect to find in this era of module. And I love those fantastic blue maps. It's got one of those, so that's great fun. Anything else you want to say about things you liked?
Yeah, I do want to praise one more thing. So we've talked about its bittiness and tone changing and so on, and all of those things are true and probably very salient. But there is a theme running through and connecting all of the segments of this, and that is, I think, transformation.
Oh, okay.
So we see lots of NPCs who have been changed into things. Like there's an Amber family member who looks like one of the cat people, but actually has just had his head changed into that of a cat. There's the ogre who hasn't changed, but has dressed herself up and believes herself to be a different person. You've got your store-owned brand Migo in the basement, turning
Yes,
people
yeah.
into brains jars. And of course, all the kind of the various curses of the Ambers and so on. So, and I think that's something that is a kind of recurring theme and gives it a bit of a unified feel. I know that's deliberate as well, because one of the notes to the GM, which is talking about, I think it's about the mirror room, but I've now lost the context, says this encounter is designed to keep the party guessing and to make sure they can never be certain which dangers are real and which are not real until they're fully investigated. I think that is a core thing of this whole adventure. Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah. So let's move on to questions we had about Castle Amber. I just have one, but it's more of a quiz to test a proposition about a certain aspect of the module presentation. So you might get this wrong, Tom, and if you do, that just proves my point. So it's not on you, it's on the module. Okay, so you're playing multiple sessions of Castle Amber, and it's going to take you 4 or 5 sessions to finish, or 7 in my case. At the end of each session, in the fiction, a really specific thing happens. What is it?
I think I know this. You all get surrounded by a magic swirly cloud of amber light. Is that it? And it preserves you. And basically, it's your save game, and it freezes you and protects you.
It's your save game, and it heals your hit points. Yeah. It heals you as well. Good, you got it. Okay, because in my opinion, it's a throwaway line in the beginning of the module, and it's so important to how you run it. Like, I feel like it should be emphasized more, because I can see a GM glossing over it, and the characters like dying really early, and everyone being like, how are we supposed to survive this? Because I don't know how you would survive it otherwise, because it has so many fights and dangers. So good, you passed the quiz.
Yay.
Yay. But I did think I remember reading through it and just distinctly thinking, wow, they're only going to mention this right here. This feels so important.
That is a good point. I think the reason it's stuck in my mind is because the imagery is so heavy-handed. So maybe that's why it's make you remember.
Like, you are literally frozen in amber, healed, and then the next session begins. Like, it's a little silly, but anyway. Okay, so you have quite a few questions.
I have a few questions. They're quite short though. They're more kind of asking you for your opinion. Okay, we have story appearances from Edgar Allan Poe and various other people. I think the Poe references are fine. However, Billy Goat's Gruff crossing a troll bridge and the Green Knight, is that good or terrible? Your thoughts?
I don't remember the Green Knight one. Which one is that? Is that the Wild Hunt?
I think he's one of the Guardians, and basically it's, can you chop my head off?
Oh, we haven't done that yet.
Oh, okay.
If he's one of the Guardians in the Stephen Amber tomb, we're not there yet. Okay. So the Billy Goat's Gruff thing is very silly. Our players didn't encounter that, but I remember reading it and thinking, well, this is kind of dumb.
Yeah, I'm not, not a fan myself. Okay.
But, whatever.
I haven't read any of them. Do you know how much this is like the Chronicles of Amber series? Like, if someone wanted to play whatever that is by Roger Zelazny, would they enjoy this? Do we know?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Okay.
I didn't know there was a connection. Is there a connection?
Supposedly there
Roger
is.
Zelazny things?
Yeah. My background reading tells me there is. Well, I don't know what it is.
The Clark Ashton Smith stuff, I'll tell you, is almost totally irrelevant in the module.
Yeah, it's just in the, because it's
just the province part. That's
you're mostly in a castle that's walled off from the rest of the setting. So
and is not in those stories. Like the Ambers are not part of that.
To be fair, you look at the NPCs in the Averoigne province setting, and I was like, oh yeah, okay, I recognize these guys. Secret wizards and bishops and stuff. Yeah.
One of the players is a big fan of that series, and they were having a they were loving that. They noticed all the references, right?
It's perfect then.
And they had a really good time with it.
Yeah.
Okay, next question.
Next, it's another reference question. The Brain Collector. It's Amigo. Lovecraft feels like one influence too many to me. Does it work in practice?
By that time, you're just like, whatever, man.
Okay. Yeah. I also have a question about the outside the castle section, which is, how does this go in terms of pace? Like, that coda is like a whole separate adventure by itself.
It is.
Out of 7 sessions, how long are you going to spend doing that bit, do you think?
So far, 2 for us.
So far, 2.
Yeah, so far 2. Yeah,
so about
I said, the Stephen Amber tomb is like 2 more sessions, probably, maybe 1, depends on how it goes. But I think it's going to take you about 2 sessions at a minimum to finish all that up. Probably 3, honestly, because we actually are only doing 3 of the MacGuffins, and so it would probably take you 3 sessions to wrap all that. It's really fun though. It's enjoyable. You have to plan for it though. Like, if you intend to do the whole thing, you have to plan for it. I did not really. I kind of my initial planning, my initial scheduling was just for the I thought I could get it all done in like 4 sessions, but that didn't end up being the case because you're right. That whole like Province of Averroin section is practically a separate adventure, and it makes the whole book kind of a campaign, like pretty close to it.
I mean, one tends to gauge how long things are going to take by the page count, right? You sort of it's a one-page thing.
Yeah.
This took 1 page, so this other thing that takes a page must be about the same. But that is absolutely not the case in this module.
Not the case here.
So,
I mean, honestly, if you have a group that's really committed to like scouring every part of the castle and doing everything in the province, and then you get to the Stephen Amber tomb at the end, I don't want to say it's quite campaign length. It's not that long, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, what else you got?
Finally, I have a counterfactual question, which is, would this thing be better if instead of it all being in, dungeon rooms and then the Amber family sometimes in that room, should it be like a court crawl? That's our phrase we've invented now, of the Ambers, something like Power Behind the Throne, where you are going to see them, and that's how it's organized, and then the rooms are like a different section. Would that make it easier to run, do you think, or would it not help that much?
Well, so like I noted before, I kind of think that's what Jim, one of my players, thought was happening. I don't know. I will say this, though. I think it is wise to take notes on the Ambers beforehand and maybe have a little list of notes handy of like all the different Ambers and what their basic function is in the module, because I didn't do that. And I frequently found myself not remembering the name of the Amber, like, oh, here's an Amber, and oh shit, like I can't remember what their name is, and I'm not in that part of the module, so damn, oh hell. And so I was just like, I found myself just making up random Ambers at a certain point.
I have to. They don't. So, the names do not help you keep track of them very well.
They're
I think.
not, yeah.
And that's kind of important because one of them has a leopard head or whatever.
Yeah.
If you get confused about which one that is, that's going to be embarrassing. They'll be like, isn't he the lion guy or whatever? Like, oh yeah.
Right, yeah.
So.
Let's go to the chain lightning round. Go ahead, Tom.
First up, we have a very thoughtful dragon. Since she is in a flammable forest, the gold dragon will breathe chlorine gas and not fire.
A little note here. I skipped over that, or I missed it or forgot it in the moment, and my gold dragon breathed fire.
Hooray.
And so when it went ham in the forest because of some stuff that happened, it burned down the indoor forest. So the entire back half of the Castle Amber dungeon for us was this like conflagration in the heart of it, destroying and melting places. So.
I think that's actually better than as written. Yeah,
I think it was fun. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I like literally forgot about the chlorine gas thing.
Nice.
So, yeah. The very first encounter, the boxing match overseen by John Lewis Amber, is probably one of the best opening encounters ever, and it's really effective for lulling the players into a feeling of confidence because they get in there, they expect something really scary, but it's this like boxing match and it's fun, and we get to bet and win gold pieces, and it's not that hard, and I don't know, it's good. It's a good like setup.
Cool. Encounter 23 is called Flowers of Evil. And with all due respect to the literary mastery of TSR in the 80s, I was surprised, pleasantly so, to find a Baudelaire reference in a D&D module.
I wonder if you're giving them too much credit, but it's okay.
No, I don't think I can be, because maybe I am.
I love menus in games, and the Haunted Feast menu is kind of fun because it's fairly straightforward, sort of fairly straightforward French country fare, but the dishes bestow magical powers, whatever. That menu is onion soup, amber wine, tossed salad, roast beef, wheat bread, green beans, mushrooms and wine sauce, red wine, apple strudel for a German touch, and brandy.
My last one, I'll just quote directly from the text, I guess. A man dressed in rich velvet robes and wearing a golden crown and other fine jewellery will suddenly appear, stepping out of the smoke and ashes. He stretches and says, "Thanks, I've been trapped in there for ages."
I love this description of the consultation room. 10 chairs are arranged in a semicircle around a desk and chair. Seated in each of the 11 chairs is a skeleton-like figure dressed in cowled amber monk's robes. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve, and today we are talking about haunted house dungeons. Why are they great? Why do them? Why write them or seek them out? Let's start with some definitions, though. When we say haunted house dungeon, We don't mean simply a dungeon that has ghosts in it, though that can be the case. It also doesn't have to be a house or a haunted castle. See earlier the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which I think qualifies as a haunted house dungeon in the way we're defining it. And the way we're defining it is it's closer to something like a dark ride at Disneyland or a funhouse / carnival kind of haunted house situation. Essentially a series of set pieces that the adventurers are moving through in a more or less linear fashion. A haunted or ghostly theme is typical, but not absolutely necessary, though very helpful because, well, we'll talk about it later, but basically there's a certain amount of like suspension of disbelief that has to happen for these to come off right. And it's one of the criticisms we had of Warlock of Firetop Mountain, and we'll talk about that. But in any case, so when we say haunted house dungeon, we don't mean that super literally or necessarily about ghosts. We mean a series of connected set pieces that you're sort of moving through like you're on a haunted house ride. So thinking of various dungeons that we've read through that are like this, that I think qualify, sort of what makes them great, some different requirements, if you will, if you want to create your own, or if you're trying to look for dungeons that capture this quality. What do you think about my definition to start, though?
Yeah, I think it's good. I'm quite pleased. I think we arrived at this independently as well. Like
we did,
I was taking notes and I was like, yeah, this is... Oh, well, my little spiel about the Disneyland stuff earlier on, yeah. I also think, Warlock of Firetop Mountain is a interesting example, because I think when we reviewed that, we compared it to Westworld, where the robots don't move until someone comes in, and then that the goblin torturer is forever whipping the one poor goblin that you walk in on. And I was trying to figure out why that felt like it didn't work, whereas this feels like it does. And I think we do have some answers.
We do indeed.
Some decent working theories. So let's try it out.
Castle Amber's a good one. Firetop Mountain's kind of a bad one.
Yeah.
So requirements for the haunted house dungeon, as we're defining it, straight away you have to have set pieces that are essentially static until the adventurers enter them. Okay. This is where a ghostly theme is helpful, like I alluded to earlier, because ghosts are just repeating things over and over again. They're stuck in their little ghostly loops. Part of the reason why Firetop Mountain feels so much more stagey and artificial is because those are living beings with agency stuck in these sort of static tableaus. Yep. So that's the difference there, right? So a ghost theme is helpful just because it helps minimize the artificiality of the set piece setup. I think that's the answer for why like one is good, one's not as great.
Exactly. If they're not ghosts, you do need some reason why they're just there and not moving around. So actually, if you think about the Pirates of the Caribbean ride in Disneyland, the reason that the pirates are there is because they're just at the pub. They're not actually waiting for you to show up.
Right, exactly.
And in fact, your presence doesn't make any difference in that case.
Yeah.
You need someone like that. So maybe you're a haunted house dungeon that's like in a science fiction setting might be a research base where people are doing repetitive tasks.
Exactly, yeah. Well, and Castle Amber does it. Like Castle Amber has literal ghosts, obviously, and undead things. But it's got other things where it's like, okay, well, the ogre's there because the ogre's sleeping. And it would be normal for the ogre to be sleeping because there's nothing to do in Castle Amber if you're trapped there. And the maiden and the unicorn are just relaxing, and they wouldn't necessarily be roaming around. They're just there, and then once you arrive, they stop relaxing to address you. So you have to have like a reason for why they're just like in this static set piece is helpful. Ghosts is easy. Undead things are easy, but you can sort of work around it if you have to. Yeah. These set pieces, I think it's also important if they don't interact with each other or are even aware of each other. That feels like an important part of making the haunted house dungeon setup work, because the more they're aware of each other and interacting with each other, the more chance there is to diminish what makes this dungeon fun and enjoyable, which is the sort of big interactive set piece quality, right? If they can kind of move around and talk to each other and are aware of each other and affect each other, there's a chance that like each of their individual experiences will be kind of degraded. Does that make sense?
It does. Although I think you can, this is going to sound weird, they can be aware of each other, but not willing to interact. So I think about the old kids show Nightmare. They would often lampshade this kind of stuff because, of course, every scene was shot on the same studio green screen area, and they could only afford like 3 actors per episode. So it would often be things like, oh, are you going that way? Well, you're sure to run into that stupid old wizard. I wouldn't listen to anything he says. And so it sort of gives you this idea there's a living world, but they'll never go anywhere near each other. There's like a chainsaw trap and a big snake in between the two.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's a better way of putting what I was kind of saying. Yeah, they can refer to each other, but they can't. Yeah. Well, this kind of flows into another point I have about, like, if we're going to list requirements of the structure of a haunted house dungeon, I think you need to structure it so that the dungeon cannot be short-circuited in any way. So the events in one room can't shut down or preclude the events in a future room. And this is where running Castle Amber and Trophy Gold was a little tricky, because Trophy Gold gives the players a lot of power to shape the fiction. And they were short-circuiting great big parts of it. And we still had a good time, and we still got the Castle Amber experience. But in D&D, you're going to get much more of the as-intended experience, because as written, no part of the Castle Amber dungeon can, like, affect another part. Like, it's impossible for the events in one room to shut down future rooms. It just doesn't. It just doesn't work. And that feels like an important part of it to me.
I think one of the interesting things that happens in modules and not in real haunted houses. Oh, actually, I guess sometimes people go back in the same one. Is that much like Ravenloft, you can access pretty much any part of the dungeon at any time.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have this thing where you go and look around what's in each area, and then go back and tackle what's in it. So that's another reason you can't they have to be compartmentalized, because it's hard to narrow down which ones are going to get visited first.
Yeah. And I think we should say here that what we're describing probably sounds a lot like just any dungeon, right? Because you go into a room and have encounters, and the encounter happens. But I think there's a distinction here. If you're playing a regular dungeon the right way, the ecology of that dungeon should be more organic, and things should be able to move around, and things should be able to be encountered in different places and in different ways. It shouldn't be as linear an experience. And so I do think there's a distinction there, and I do think there are two different kinds of fun, though verbalizing it here is probably a little tricky. Some other structural things, there does have to be a certain degree of linearity, and it has to be a really particular kind of linearity, which is the encounters start out fairly easy, even whimsical. And here, this is a lot like a haunted house ride or a walking attraction kind of thing. The things start out fairly easy, maybe even a little whimsical, but then they get more perilous as they go on, and they lead up to a sort of big, weird finish. This is how the Haunted Mansion ride at Disneyland goes. It's a little goofy in the beginning, and it kind of stays goofy throughout, to be fair. But as it goes on, it does get to be a little bit more decadent, a little bit more lush, a little bit more, there's a more heightened sense of danger. But then it kind of finishes with this, like, kind of weird, kind of goes back to goofy, right? It's kind of like weird, like little goofy finish. You can see this structure in other dungeons that are like this. I think the Manticore one is a great example of that.
Mordzingersturm, isn't it?
Mordzingersturm, yeah. The way it builds is pretty great there. Castle Amber is obviously very much this. We've talked about that already. It has this almost lighthearted feel. That boxing match is like, it almost feels safe. It goes from like gonzo, even a little screwy, to darker and quite terrifying by the end, or weird and Lovecraftian at the end. So I think that's a great way of structuring it. The sort of linearity is a sort of thematic or tone linearity, which I think is important. I do think, though, that we should talk about what makes the experience not on rails necessarily, because everybody hates things to be on rails. In a lot of ways, I think the Haunted House dungeon is on rails. I think it's kind of unavoidable. I don't think it has to feel that way. And furthermore, I think that it's more appropriate to think about it in terms of something I've talked about a lot, which is the corridor rather than the rail.
Yeah.
The corridor lets you move side to side, right? Like, you are always going to the end of the corridor, but you can stop by in the rooms along the way to see what's in those rooms. I think that's more what the experience should be like. And it makes it feel not so much on rails, because when we played Castle Amber, there were things that the players just didn't want to interact with. They were like, we're not going to do that.
Yeah,
we'll just move on to the next thing.
Like in Muppet Babies, when they open the door, there's a dinosaur, they close it, they go to the next one, So.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's that kind of thing, right? So it's a linear experience. It's a little bit on rails, but there's a lot of freedom there. The players still have choices they get to make and stuff like that, right? What they get to, as we've said before, they get to choose what they want to interact with.
Yeah, and even if you're doing a more quote unquote player skill focused style of play, that still works, because you get to choose not just which doors you go through, but you can open them, look inside, figure out if you're ready to tackle that thing, and come back. One of the things I think makes a key difference, or what makes Castle Amber good, is I could see that there are so many of these situations where you get to decide when you're going to interact with the core thing in there. It's not like a lot of less well-written dungeons that may have a similar floor plan, but the encounters aren't as good. Are things like you open the door, there are some rat people, and they attack you.
Right.
You open the door, now you have to do a thing. Whereas in Castle Amber, they are kind of static puzzles, like the Globe of Glass thing. You can leave that for days and come back to it later if you want, till you figured it out. But also, even the ones that are violent, I think it's more a case, maybe I'm wrong on this because of course I've only read it, but they tend to feel like they can turn violent, but you'll see it coming. You've always got a chance to back off. And probably you're going to have to come back and do that thing later because you do need to get these silver keys. But the order in which you do that and whether you've been surrounded by swirling orange light recently or not will affect that decision. Is that how it kind of plays out?
That's exactly right. That's exactly how it feels. And I think that's one of those, when I was trying to make the distinction earlier between like this type of dungeon that we're sort of defining here versus just a normal sort of dungeon, I think that's the major difference. In a regular dungeon, you just open the door and you fight the thing, right? The thing is going to chase you. It's going to be there. You got to deal with it. The Haunted House dungeon is just different. It's set pieces that you get to walk into if you wish, and you get to interact with if you wish.
Yeah.
Like the chapel, for example, in Castle Amber, you can avoid literally all of that. You can literally open the door, peek inside, and say, nope, and keep going. There's nothing, there's like literally nothing stopping you from doing that. But some groups will want to prod, right? So they want to see what happens. I think a tour guide is something that these dungeons usually have, or something like it. So in horror fiction, we think of like the Crypt Keeper type character, but the Manticore, again, Mordsengersturm, because that is a 100% haunted house dungeon, and Mordsengersturm is a tour guide.
He literally gives you a tour,
Literally gives you a tour of the place.
Yeah.
Castle Amber doesn't have a single tour guide, but rather like dozens of them. Castle Amber is more like ride operators stationed at the various places to like keep you going, right? And the tour guide concept is helpful because this is a more or less quote unquote on rails experience. You need a way to gently prod the characters back to where they need to be. You have to kind of always keep them like going back to the main track and moving down the road. And so the tour guide character is a great way of doing that. And then I guess the last thing I'll say that feels like a requirement for this type of dungeon is there has to be a reason that the adventurers can't just leave.
Yeah.
That feels really important to me, right? Because I feel like you would just leave. I know that once my players in Castle Amber started to really feel the heat, like once it kind of stops being a lighthearted thing and becomes a quite dangerous thing, they wanted to leave. But they couldn't leave. And they knew that. They knew they were trapped in a dimension. They knew there's specific things they had to do to get out. And so they had no choice but to keep going. And also, going back to the weird amber light thing, that is just another sort of inducement to stay. It's a requirement, like they can't leave. But basically, it's a support thing. It's like, okay, you can't go anywhere. We acknowledge that. And so at the end of every session, this strange amber light is going to come freeze you and heal your hit points. Maybe you have devices in your dungeon that aren't so on the nose, but I think you have to kind of set it up to where the adventurers kind of have to stay there. It can be tricky because you don't want anything to feel forced, but
true. Well, I mean, I think if you signed up to play Castle Amber, you're probably on board with the
that's
magic
the thing,
font,
right?
But
that's the thing. Yeah. I think at a certain point you're just like, okay, we're locked in. This is what we're doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think you just need to consult any horror movie plot write up on Wikipedia to find some good examples. Oh, the boat's not coming for 5 days.
Precisely. So, okay, the thing we haven't really talked about here, and I think we need to talk about, is why the Haunted House dungeon? Like, why do this? Why seek out these modules or create modules like this, especially when it does seem a little artificial and stagey, and especially because there's a danger of getting something like Warlock on Firetop Mountain, which I think is a poor Haunted House dungeon. Why do this? Like, what is the reason? I have some thoughts, but what do you want to start?
I think the staginess, though, is part of the fun.
Yeah.
There is a certain joy to exactly that kind of arch. There are sort of two ways to do it. I'm going to use one of my companion adventures early now and talk about the game show The Crystal Maze. I don't know, have you ever seen this?
I've seen like YouTube clips of it, but we didn't really have that in the States.
Much like Castle Amber, it has massive shifts of tone in that it's divided into 4 zones, like the Aztec zone, the medieval zone.
Right,
and they go around doing these. You go into a room and one person does a mystery or a skill or a strength game or whatever. And there's 2 approaches to this. So in the olden classic days, when it was hosted by Richard O'Brien, yes, the guy from the Rocky Horror Show, he would talk to the camera and make snarky asides, but quite kind ones about the contestants, play the harmonica, invent off-camera characters that he'd been visiting, but he'd never break character with it. Which I think is, there's this like a YouTube channel my son likes, which is basically about racing Hot Wheels cars on surprisingly good scenery. And what I love about it is they do commentary and they never break character. They always pretend these tiny cars are being driven by real tiny people. And so that's one thing. But you can also do the Richard Ayoade version of Crystal Maze, where you do just embrace that it's all a bit fake. He says stuff like, when you go through the door, you'll be wearing a helmet. That's because of editing. And so he just really, he's really into the absolute artificiality of the whole thing, sometimes talking about budget cuts, and that's why they don't have this game they had last week. And I think that's another valid approach. But I think you have to choose one and stick with it.
Yes.
It's not going to work if you try and chop and change. But you should embrace it. You shouldn't try and just paper over it and make it pretend that it's realistic, because I don't think that's going to last.
I think you've nailed it. The thing here, the reason why you do this kind of dungeon is it's pretty simple. It's just fun. I mean, it's fun. It's guaranteed fun. If you have designed 6 really good set pieces, or if the module writer designed 6 really good set pieces with 6 really cool characters and activities to do, you're going to have 6 really fun encounters. And I think that's really important. You know, you and I talk a lot about big ideas of theme in adventure writing and Russian film editing technique and all these other things we talk about, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes like fun is an important component of playing games, right? It's a really important component. And this is like a straight beeline to just a really, really fun experience. I don't think you can do this all the time.
No.
It's going to get a little old. So the Haunted House Dungeon is a good side quest or a break within your longer campaign. I think there's a role for it. Going back to this idea of like on rails or not on rails, the Haunted House Dungeon is a time when you may want to be on rails. You may be at a point in your campaign where you just want to have like a more fun guided experience, right? And this is a great opportunity to do that and still have some danger and still have some choice to make, but are ultimately kind of being funneled along. That's fun from time to time. Yeah. Like you need those breaks from your sort of more sprawling drama heavy campaign or whatever. Yeah, it's just a good time. And it's a slightly different way of doing a dungeon, and it's good fun.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yep. That's it. All right, let's go do some companion adventures.
All right, it's the companion adventures. I only have a few, so you have a couple more than me, so why don't you get started?
Yeah, well, I just thought I would attempt to helpfully narrow down the Edgar Allan Poe references as well, because he wrote a lot of stories. They're not all in here. The relevant ones to read are, I think, The Fall of the House of Usher. I won't do the spoilers of why it's relevant, but so Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of the Red Death, and a bit peculiarly, but one of his better ones, and based on an incident involving when the King of France got set on fire in real life, Hop Frog, which is where Petit Singe, or Little Ape the Jester, comes from. Yeah, that's my Edgar Allan Poe. I'll just do a quick other dark fantasy short stories recommendation. That is, C.L. Moore wrote not that many, I think maybe only 2 or 3, but they're pretty good. Short stories about a character called Girelle of Jouarre. She's a sort of armor-wearing, crossbow-bolt-dodging noblewoman in another fantastical France, and just has exceptional writing. And C.L. Moore's characteristic thing was these sort of cosmic, but very, I'm going to say sensual, not in the sense maybe it's usually used, but very kind of things about sensations and alien feelings and encounters with beings that operate in ways that are totally inhuman. But that's what's down the spiral staircase under a fictional French castle in these stories. So yeah, they're really worth checking out if you can find a copy.
I love it. Let's do film things. I was going to suggest, I think I've recommended this before in another episode, but the 1977 Japanese film House is a pretty terrific haunted house movie. And, you know, I felt like we had to have a haunted house movie recommendation here.
Yeah.
That one's on the more like weird, surreal side, and I think it's quite enjoyable.
Okay, my film is from 2002, and that's Russian Ark. It's mostly famous for its technical achievement of being shot around the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in a single shot with hundreds and hundreds of actors in it. But in it, you, the viewer, the camera, are guided around by this, I forget who the character is, but he's sort of someone who claims to have been around when Tsar Peter the Great? Yeah, when he was around. And so much like Castle Amber, it's this sort of going into one sumptuous room after another, meeting eccentric figures from history.
Right.
I think it's a better film, or a more engaging film, than its reputation for just a technical feat deserves. And I think it actually is a good structural and visual inspiration for Castle Amber.
Terrific. You've already mentioned Crystal Maze, but I will emphasize it here again. I'm going to say, because this is not really in the same vein as what we've been talking about as far as like haunted house goes, but the podcast 13 Days of Halloween, it's an anthology horror podcast that uses the guided exploration of a haunted house as its premise. And I'm listening to it right now, and so I just want an excuse to talk about it in some ways. But I will say, this is so worth listening to because it does the coolest thing with audio that I've probably ever heard in a podcast. It uses this 3-dimensional audio, so you definitely want to listen to it with headphones. And the way it positions the sounds and the voices, and sometimes characters are suddenly whispering in your ear. Like it's so cool and so immersive, and highly recommended. And the last thing I'm going to say is dark ride YouTubers. So a dark ride, of course, as we've noted before, is the sort of Alice in Wonderland, Pirates of the Caribbean, like rides at Disneyland. They are usually inside a building, or like that new Star Wars one. They're inside a building, and it's mostly about just going through scenes. There are a lot of YouTubers who like film the ride so you get to experience the whole ride secondhand via YouTube. And there's one channel called Attractions 360, which does a pretty good job with their dark ride videos. And with that, that is our show. Listeners, Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. There's a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support Fear of a Black Dragon financially, we love that. Please do so at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Jason, thank you. And thank you to our epic editor, Rich Rogers. And thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Can you hear the footsteps in the shadows? Can you smell the metal tang of blood on the air? Can you feel the veil between worlds slipping away with each heartbeat? The Between is here. The Between is a tabletop role-playing game about a group of mysterious monster hunters in Victorian-era London. These hunters learn about monsters and killers throughout the city and conduct investigations in order to neutralize them. Over time, they become aware of the plans of a criminal mastermind who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. They will eventually be forced to confront this mastermind in order to save Queen and Country. The Between is directly inspired by the TV show Penny Dreadful, but also takes inspiration from British horror classics, the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, pulp-era media, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and from Hell. It's powered by the Apocalypse and uses the mystery system from our hit game Brindlewood Bay. The Between comes with a 129-page rulebook, 7 playbooks, 10 scenarios or threats, a mastermind campaign sheet, reference sheets, and a supplement called London at Night, the Unseen. The Between PDF is available now on the Gauntlet Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/gauntlet. The Between will be available on DriveThru RPG starting June 14th.